Every eye in the palace froze the moment she pointed. The young alien princess's silver hair shimmered under the twin suns, her long ears tilted with audacious certainty, and all she said was, "Mother, that's the one." And just like that, the human standing awkwardly in ceremonial shoes realized he had just become the center of an entire world, one that was far more dangerous, dazzling, and absurd than he could have ever imagined. The twin suns cast a soft, lilac haze across the spires of the palace, their crystalline surfaces refracting light into 1,000 fragmented rainbows that danced across the polished floors of the grand hall. The human had never seen anything like it. He had expected a palace, yes. He had imagined gleaming corridors, grand staircases, alien statuary, but nothing had prepared him for the sensation of standing inside a living prism, a place that seemed to hum with quiet energy as though the walls themselves breathed. He shuffled forward cautiously, conscious of every sound. The soft hum of hovering attendants, the quiet murmur of nobles moving like shadows, and the odd squeak his ill-fitting ceremonial shoes made on the crystal floor. He tried to remember which hand to keep on his chest, which foot to step forward, and whether it was polite to blink slowly in alien culture or whether that was an insult. By the time he realized he had been holding his breath, he nearly passed out. A robotic attendant drifted close, its spherical body rotating lazily, with tiny mechanical arms that ended in soft pincers. "Welcome, honored guest," it said in a voice that had a tinny echo, like someone speaking through a can. Ceremonial orientation protocols suggest engaging in polite posture and minimal movement. The human gave a weak smile. Right, polite posture, minimal movement, got it. He immediately tripped over a slight rise in the floor, waving his arms desperately as if he could convince gravity to forgive him. The attendant's pincers twitched, and he swore he saw the machine's eyes widen, if machines could widen eyes. Then she arrived. The young princess. He noticed her before anyone else did because of the way the hall seemed to bend toward her presence. The crowd shifted, whispering and rustling like leaves in a breeze. Her skin glowed a soft pearl white, catching the fractured light of the palace and making her look as if she were partially made of the same crystal that surrounded them. Her ears were long, tapering upward like the tips of aerodynamic wings, delicate but proud, a visible mark of her species. Her hair was silver, cascading in a loose braid threaded with faintly luminescent filaments, twinkling like tiny stars caught in a comet's tail. There was something mischievous in the tilt of her head, a hint that the serious demeanor of a royal had not yet smothered her humor. She walked with a strange confidence, one foot gliding as if gravity followed a slightly different set of rules around her. The human's heart skipped. It wasn't fear exactly, but the kind of wonder that made him forget how to breathe. He tried to straighten his shoulders, imagining himself heroic or at least respectable, but the borrowed tunic pulled awkwardly across his chest and reminded him that he looked more like a kid trying to play dress-up than a guest worthy of a princess's attention. The princess stopped a mere few feet away, her eyes, enormous and glimmering with subtle gold flecks, fixed on him. The room seemed to hush, not by command, not by etiquette, but as if the air itself had paused in deference to the moment. The hum of hovering drones quieted. A noble mid-step froze, his elaborate headpiece wobbling dangerously. Even the holographic chandeliers flickered slightly, as if blinking in disbelief. "Mother, that's the one," she said, pointing directly at him. The words rolled across the hall like a shockwave, abrupt, unignorable, and utterly absurd. The human blinked. Twice, 3 times. He swallowed, hoping a cough would disguise his confusion, but no cough came. He was suddenly aware of the squeak his shoes made, the heat rising to his cheeks, and the surreal notion that the entirety of an alien court had just paused to witness his humiliation. The queen, regal and imperious, turned slowly. Her own ears were long and proud, her crown embedded with softly pulsing energy crystals that tracked the movement of the hall like living things. She arched an eyebrow, which in itself was a feat of alien anatomy that made him wonder if she could raise one without raising the other. "Excuse me," she said, though the tone suggested she had already understood. The princess's choice was no accident. and yet the audacity made the human wish fervently that the floor might open and swallow him whole. Whispers erupted around him. One advisor muttered, "Surely she refers to the envoy from Lyra 9. Another, unable to resist, added under his breath, "Or perhaps she's picking him because he can't walk properly in ceremonial shoes." The human tried a smile, an attempt at humor, but it came out as a kind of nervous grimace. "Ah, well, you know me," he stammered. "I'm very presentable." A few hidden chuckles escaped, and he dared to hope that laughter could act as a shield, even here in the heart of alien formality. The princess, however, remained unruffled. There was a sparkle in her eye that suggested she enjoyed his discomfort. Yes, but more than that, it seemed she saw in him something the court did not. Perhaps it was the unpolished awkwardness that contrasted sharply with the perfection around him, or the faint, human stubbornness that made him continue standing even when every instinct told him to collapse. She tilted her head slightly, lips curling in what could only be called a smile, or at least the alien equivalent of one, and said, "You are braver than you know." The hall tried to recover. Robotic attendants resumed their slow rotations. Nobles adjusted their postures, and somewhere in the upper galleries, a servant's hovering cart bumped a wall and made a tinny crash. The human winced, expecting a lecture, but the princess let out a soft, musical laugh that made him realize that this might not be a disaster after all. Her laughter had a peculiar effect. It warmed the room, making the impossible seem just a little more bearable. Even the queen's expression softened slightly, though her eyes still radiated authority. The human, emboldened by the hint of amusement, attempted another joke. "So, do I get a crown, a scepter, or just the universal nod of approval?" He could almost hear the eye rolls from 1,000 years of alien court tradition. The princess tilted her head further, considering, then tapped a finger to her chin, mock serious. "I think a nod would suffice for now, unless you insist on a crown, in which case you may borrow mine temporarily. It hums a lot, though, so be careful." The human laughed, a short, awkward bark that drew a ripple of genuine chuckles from the nearby court members. Amid the laughter, the tension subtly shifted. The declaration had been bold, startling, and almost certainly unprecedented, yet the humor softened the edges. The princess guided him through the hall, pointing out floating gardens, anti-gravity fountains, and libraries where books hovered midair like tiny satellites, all while making playful comments about the oddities of human balance in zero-relative gravity zones. He stumbled frequently, and each stumble was met with a teasing grin or a witty remark that made him forget the gravity of his situation. Still, the reality of what had happened could not be ignored. He was now the focus of the palace, the unwitting center of political, cultural, and perhaps cosmic attention. Each noble glance, each cautious nod, each quiet whisper carried weight beyond his comprehension. Yet as the princess continued her light-hearted banter, weaving jokes and playful teases through the intricate corridors of power, the human began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he could navigate this strange world without completely embarrassing himself. The crystal walls reflected their shadows as they walked side by side. The twin suns outside cast long, surreal shapes through the tall windows, creating illusions of floating light that danced around them. Somewhere in the distance, a hovering servant dropped a tray of floating fruit, only for the princess to catch it effortlessly with a flick of her long, graceful fingers. She handed one to him, winking. "First lesson," she said, voice playful. "If something falls, catch it, or make a joke about it, preferably both." And so the human laughed again, feeling the tension ebb slightly, the impossible beauty and audacity of the palace, and of the princess herself, beginning to feel less like a threat and more like a world he might, with care and missteps, inhabit. In the midst of dazzling technology, floating architecture, and ancient customs, a fragile bridge was forming, not built by diplomacy, not built by protocol, but by something far more unpredictable. Humor, human awkwardness, and the daring heart of a young alien princess with long ears and a penchant for making impossibly bold choices. The human followed the princess down a corridor that seemed to twist subtly as they walked, walls of transparent alloy bending light and revealing glimpses of the cityscape beyond. Towering towers glinted in hues he had no names for, and floating vehicles wove between them with precision that seemed almost alive. "You're lucky this palace doesn't like moving hallways," she said, glancing back at him with a teasing grin. "Otherwise you'd be a permanent tourist attraction, spinning helplessly in circles while everyone else walked by. Honestly, your shoes might survive better in zero relative gravity." He laughed, though it came out more like a wheeze than a sound, and stumbled slightly over a step that didn't quite exist, or maybe it did, and the floor just pretended it didn't. "You mean I might become a display?" he asked, voice high and nervous. She nodded solemnly, which made him snort, nearly colliding with a hovering plant pod filled with luminescent flowers that responded to touch by releasing faint puffs of scented mist. The plant quivered at his proximity, and he raised his hands, muttering, "I promise I come in peace." The princess giggled, and the sound made the floating flowers sway like a small, enchanted forest. As they moved deeper into the palace, he noticed the walls were not just transparent, but alive in a way, shifting faintly, like they were breathing or thinking. Images flickered across their surfaces, holographic memories of past celebrations and battles, all curated by some subtle intelligence that seemed part of the palace itself. One particularly daring display showed a previous princess mid-leap, performing some ritual that involved juggling spheres of levitating light. "That's me, kind of," the princess said with a shrug. "Well, not exactly me. That was my cousin." She tripped over her own feet mid-leap and almost knocked out the royal chef. True story. They still won the festival, though, somehow. She laughed at the memory, the corners of her eyes crinkling in a human-like way that made him forget she wasn't human. He shook his head, trying to process the strangeness. "So, you all just juggle floating orbs and hope the chef survives?" The princess raised a delicate brow. "Survival is overrated. Style points matter more. Speaking of which, you might want to practice. I hear the banquet will include levitating cutlery. You drop one spoon, and suddenly the entire court is judging your hand-eye coordination." He grimaced, imagining himself flinging utensils into orbit and creating a diplomatic incident of cosmic proportions. "Great! I already trip over air. Now I have to not ruin dinner." She laughed again, the sound carrying warmth that eased the knot of anxiety in his chest. "Relax. You'll be fine. Worst case, I'll catch the flying soup before it hits your face. Or we'll just pretend it's part of the ceremony. People love improvisation here." They entered a room that resembled a greenhouse suspended midair, with plants that seemed to defy gravity, spiraling slowly in place as though orbiting invisible suns. Tiny creatures with translucent wings flitted between the foliage, emitting soft musical tones whenever they touched a leaf or petal. "This is one of my favorite spots," the princess said, moving with a lightness that made him feel like he was dragging a boulder behind him. "It's calming, unless you're afraid of music made by bugs. Then, maybe hold your ears." He laughed again, a little more freely this time. "Afraid of bugs?" He paused, peering at a tiny winged creature that hovered curiously near him. "I think that one is plotting my death." The princess's laughter bubbled over, and she tapped the creature lightly. "Nope, that one's a pacifist, but the big one in the corner, watch out, likes to play tag with the royal guests. Last time, it stole a senator's hat, and nobody knew whose hat it was for a week." He shook his head, incredulous, but also captivated. This world, so alien, so filled with rules he didn't understand, was simultaneously absurd and breathtaking. And the princess, with her long, elegant ears and silver braid catching the light, seemed to navigate it all effortlessly, blending mischief, authority, and charm in a way that made him feel simultaneously invisible and completely seen. As they moved on, the princess gestured toward a small floating orb that projected a three-dimensional map of their star system. "Here's the tricky part," she said. "You now have a role in galactic navigation. Don't worry, it's mostly symbolic. Mostly. The planets move slightly differently here than back home, so if you accidentally nudge one, well, we'll cross that bridge if it starts orbiting the wrong star." He peered at the orb, which spun slowly, showing planets in vivid colors, some blue and green like Earth, some shimmering with gaseous storms that shifted in fractal patterns, and others glowing faintly with bioluminescence from the surface. "So what exactly am I supposed to do?" he asked. "Push buttons, say the right words, avoid touching the glowing planet with the suspicious rings." The princess smirked, leaning on the edge of the holographic display. "Mostly, don't panic. And if you do panic, panic stylishly. Remember, court appearances are about presentation. Look slightly heroic, raise an eyebrow occasionally, and try to look like you know what's going on. Nobody will check the details." She tapped his shoulder lightly. "Consider it your first lesson in surviving the palace." He laughed, shaking his head. "Surviving seems like a generous term. I feel like I'm being tested in ways I don't understand." She leaned closer, eyes sparkling. "Exactly. That's the fun part. Life's more interesting when you don't know all the rules. And besides, you're officially chosen now. That gives you some leverage, mostly in my jokes, but still." They reached a balcony overlooking the lower gardens, where streams of luminescent water twisted and floated upward before cascading gently down into artificial rivers. The view was breathtaking, but the human couldn't help noticing that he had nearly slipped twice on the invisible anti-gravity field the princess had set up to make the balcony appear suspended. "So, this is your backyard?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's one of them," she said, tossing her braid lightly over her shoulder. "We have a few. You'll see, my family likes to keep things interesting. Some gardens float, some rooms change shape slightly depending on mood, and occasionally the ceiling will rearrange itself. It's like living in a funhouse designed by slightly over-caffeinated engineers." He laughed nervously, then pointed at a small creature skimming the surface of one of the rivers. "That thing, is it dangerous?" The princess watched it for a moment. "Not at all. It's harmless unless you try to ride it. Then it develops an opinion about your life choices very quickly." He grimaced at the thought of the creature deciding his fate. "Good to know. I'll just stay on the balcony then." The princess leaned on the railing beside him, glancing down at the glowing water. "You're handling this better than most humans do," she said softly. "Most panic, some cry, some try to negotiate with plants." She laughed at her own joke, and he felt a warmth spread in his chest at how effortlessly she infused humor into the surreal and overwhelming. "And yet," she continued, her tone shifting slightly, "you're still human enough to trip over nothing, laugh at my jokes, and ask questions that make me realize just how much of this world we take for granted. That's why I chose you. You don't just stand here. You notice, you react, you exist in a way that's interesting." He swallowed, heart hammering, and tried to respond with something witty, but the words caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. That's, wow. I didn't even know I was being chosen until a minute ago." She smirked, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "Exactly. That's the point. Life is better when you don't expect it. Besides, it keeps things entertaining. Court drama aside, you might even enjoy it here if you survive the first week." He looked at her, silver braid glinting in the light, long ears twitching slightly as she considered some unspoken thought, and couldn't help but laugh. "Survive the first week. That sounds like a video game challenge level." "Better," she said, pointing toward the floating map again. "This one has real consequences, but don't worry, I'll make sure the hazards are amusing, mostly, maybe." He groaned, but it was the kind of groan that carried a smile, a recognition that, somehow in this bizarre, luminous, absurd palace, he might find a place, even if that place involved floating furniture, sentient plants, and the occasional homicidal insect. The princess glanced at him, her eyes sparkling with quiet triumph, as if she had won a small but significant victory just by keeping him upright, laughing, and slightly terrified all at once. And so they moved on, side by side, down twisting corridors, over floating bridges, past holographic displays of battles, celebrations, and absurd royal fashion experiments, each step a mix of wonder, humor, and quiet fear. The palace, alive with its own intelligence, seemed to watch them, curious how a human might navigate this alien labyrinth of light, levitation, and tradition. He stumbled occasionally, tripped on invisible steps, and dropped more than one anti-gravity cube, each mishap met with teasing laughter or a playful scolding from the princess. By the time they reached the inner courtyard, glowing softly under the twin suns, he realized something. He had survived. Somehow. He hadn't tripped into a floating fountain, been publicly humiliated beyond repair, or accidentally set a planet spinning the wrong way. More importantly, he had laughed. And in the palace of precise etiquette, political games, and centuries of unbroken tradition, laughter was nothing short of revolutionary. The court had convened again in the grand hall, this time under a tense but oddly expectant hush. The human stood near the center, slightly awkward in ceremonial attire that still didn't fit, now aware that everyone's eyes, from the hovering drones to the oldest advisor who had been whispering across 3 generations, were upon him. The twin suns outside filtered through the crystalline spires, casting a soft lavender glow over the gathering, and for once, he realized the light itself seemed to lean in, waiting. The young princess, her silver braid catching the shifting spectrum of the hall, stood confidently beside him, her long ears angled ever so slightly toward her mother, as if she were daring the queen to object. The queen's expression was unreadable at first, her eyes glinting like polished obsidian. The crown above her head hummed faintly, pulsing with energy that synchronized with the heartbeat of the hall itself. "You have caused quite a stir, child," she said finally, her voice echoing with authority. "And this human, you claim he is worthy of notice." The princess tilted her head, a mischievous spark in her gaze. "I do. He may stumble over shoes and hover cubes, and he may not understand our etiquette fully, but he notices things. He laughs when situations are absurd. He reacts when others would merely obey. That mother is more valuable than any trained diplomat or noble-born courtier. He is unexpectedly competent." The human nearly choked on the word, competent, unsure whether to bow, grin, or flee. He tried a nervous joke, hoping to diffuse tension. Competent? I usually just survive by tripping less than expected." The princess snorted, nudging him with her elbow. "See, he even understands humor. A critical skill for surviving royal judgment, apparently." The queen raised an eyebrow, though the corner of her mouth twitched in the faintest hint of amusement. "You may possess some qualities we did not anticipate," she admitted slowly. "But this court is bound by protocol, by tradition, by centuries of interstellar diplomacy. To accept this requires a leap of faith." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, and the hall remained silent, waiting for the next act in a drama centuries in the making. The human shifted nervously, then found his voice. "Ma'am, I didn't come here looking to be, well, chosen, I guess. But if it's a leap of faith you need, I can promise this. I may be clumsy, I may not know all your rules, but I'll do my best. And I'll keep trying to make people laugh, at least enough to survive court dinners." His words drew a ripple of laughter, not disrespectful but relieved, and even the queen's lips twitched upward. The princess stepped forward, pointing a graceful finger at a hovering orb projecting a holographic display of the court's political networks, trade routes, and planetary alliances. "See all this?" she said, eyes sparkling. "That's important. But sometimes the right choice isn't in the charts or maps. Sometimes it's in the way someone reacts when gravity tries to ruin their shoes. Sometimes it's in the laughter they bring when everything else is serious. I choose him because he notices what matters." The hall seemed to breathe, a subtle vibration moving through the floors and walls, as if the palace itself acknowledged the pronouncement. The advisors muttered among themselves, weighing centuries of protocol against the audacity of a princess who could see value beyond the rigid lines of tradition. One older counselor, a stooped figure with lenses that projected faint holographic symbols with every blink, finally cleared his throat. "Perhaps there is merit in novelty, in perspective outside our usual parameters. If she sees potential, perhaps we should observe rather than obstruct." A ripple of agreement spread, faint but growing, as the remaining courtiers began nodding, whispering, and even chuckling quietly at the way the human shifted nervously, as if realizing that he might, against all odds, have a place here. The queen studied the human for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the way he looked both out of place and remarkably composed under scrutiny. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she inclined her head. "So be it. Let this union, if union it may be, proceed under my cautious approval. But understand, human, that your actions will be observed, your choices noted. The palace does not forgive folly lightly. The human's chest tightened, not with fear but with a mix of pride and disbelief. He tried a joke, shaking off some of the tension. Noted, I promise to mostly behave. I'll even try to step lightly on floating floors and dodge sentient flowers. The princess laughed so openly that the sound echoed through the hall, catching even the queen's attention, who allowed herself a faint smile. Over the following hours, the court subtly shifted to accommodate this new reality. Nobles whispered, but their tone changed from suspicion to curiosity. Robotic attendants hovered closer to ensure his stability without smothering him. Holographic maps adjusted to include subtle markers tracking his presence, almost ceremoniously. The princess guided him through minor tasks, a diplomatic greeting, a gesture to a floating garden creature, a small ceremonial toast, each time infusing the situation with humor to ease tension, and teaching him the rhythms of the court in a way no formal lesson could. The human discovered that he could navigate more than just protocol. He could navigate relationships, humor, and culture with surprising agility. He laughed when he stumbled over invisible steps. He joked when a holographic chandelier projected itself too low. He even engaged with the palace intelligence, a subtle AI woven into the walls, whose only purpose was to challenge court visitors with riddles and trivia. Somehow he passed the test, not by brilliance, but by adaptability and a willingness to embrace absurdity. By evening, the twin suns had dipped, leaving the palace bathed in the pale violet glow of its internal bioluminescence. The human stood on the balcony again, side by side with the princess, looking out at a city of floating towers, luminescent gardens, and vehicles that danced through the air as if choreographed. She nudged him gently. "You've changed," she said simply. "You've learned quickly and you've laughed when you could have panicked. That makes all the difference." He smiled, brushing a hand through his hair in the way that still seemed absurd in ceremonial attire. "I guess I have, but I couldn't have done it without you. You make all this survivable, even fun." She leaned slightly, her long ears twitching in amusement. "I told you, survival is part observation, part humor. You've passed the first week, which is more than most humans manage." Her laughter carried softly on the warm breeze, mingling with the hum of the palace, the subtle music of floating insects, and the gentle whispers of water spiraling upward in the inner fountains. The human realized something important in that moment. He belonged in a way he had never imagined. Not by conquest, not by diplomacy, not even by accident, but by connection. He had arrived a stranger, awkward and unprepared. He would leave, not as royalty, but as someone recognized, chosen, and unexpectedly capable of thriving in a world far beyond his own. The princess squeezed his arm lightly, pointing toward a floating sphere projecting a model of the galactic systems they govern together. "There are challenges ahead," she said. "Political, practical, and possibly very awkward. But you can handle them. And I'll be here, mostly laughing, mostly teasing, definitely judging your choices when necessary." He laughed in return, the sound full and confident, no longer hesitant. "Then I guess I better keep up. Or at least keep tripping stylishly, as you suggested." As the hall behind them settled into quiet routine, the palace alive with its own rhythm and intelligence, the human realized how much he had grown. He had entered this world expecting chaos and confusion, and yet, through humor, courage, and unexpected adaptability, he had carved a place for himself in the heart of an alien empire. The princess beside him, bright, daring, and unflinchingly audacious, had chosen him for reasons he was only beginning to understand, but reasons that, in the end, proved the truest measure of worth. The twin suns dipped fully, leaving the palace in a serene glow. The human and the princess stood together, laughter still lingering in the air, the court now quietly supportive, the palace's intelligence acknowledging them with subtle pulses of light. The world, alien, beautiful, and filled with improbable wonder, felt like home for the first time. And in that moment, amid floating gardens, levitating fountains, and the playful, mischievous light of a young princess who had dared to choose differently, the human understood something profound. Life was not about perfection, protocol, or surviving unscathed. It was about embracing the unexpected, laughing through it, and finding a place where one truly belonged. The palace breathed around them, alive with possibility, and the human felt, finally, at ease.